This is the Barbell Notes Research Talk. I'm your host, Gergő Somodi, and in this episode, I invited Professor Guy Hornsby and two PhD students to discuss recent scientific discoveries about pulling exercises. I hope you will enjoy the show. Hello, guys. Thanks for accepting the invitation for this call. The topic today is for this episode is the snatch pull and isometric mid-thigh pull related research. And I had two reasons to bring together this episode. One of them being the research that we are doing in relation with the Barbell Notes application, where we collect data on various assistance exercises and examine the correlations there. But because we are validating an old study in the 1980s, the snatch pull wasn't part of that research, and it's kind of missing. And I want to bring the coaches a little bit of knowledge about the snatch pull as well, because it's part of the arsenal of the weightlifters. And then also the other one was that talking to you separately in relation to the application and the research, I realized that you are working on the same topic. So I was kind of thinking it would be nice to bring together a community and exchange ideas to advance science, so to say, in a international collaboration. So before we go on, just I would like to ask all of you just to say a couple of words about you for those that might not know you. I don't know who wants to start.
I can start.
Let's go, Kyle. Cool.
So my name is Kyle Rochau. I am a doctorate student at West Virginia University. My emphasis, basically the title of my degree is coaching and teaching studies, and my emphasis is on sports science and coaching. I'm 3 years in, and I'm very interested in weightlifting and very interested in isometric force, kind of more the topic of my studies, isometric force of weightlifters at various positions, much like we'll talk about later on with Tavor and Dr. Hornsby. But that's me right there.
I guess to keep it in not just the United States, but in West Virginia, my name is Guy Hornsby. I'm an assistant professor in coaching and performance science. I've been at West Virginia University since 2016. Since I've been here, I've been the head coach of the university's weightlifting club. We have an undergraduate, a master's, and a doctoral degree. The doctoral degree is a joint degree between coaching and physical education. I'm a volunteer coach for WVU track and field, which is part of the athletic department here at WVU, and I oversee a grant that provides, in the form of 3 graduate assistantships, a head strength coach to each of the 3 high schools in Montague County, which is the county that WVU is in. And so I oversee that program, bring in the students, coordinate things, and I guess just more generally, I'm interested in applied sports science research that generally tends to be more anaerobic based, strength power based sport. Of those, weightlifting is my the one I work in the most and probably have the most interest in. And so, yeah, happy for the discussion, and thank you, Gregio, to put this together for us.
You're most welcome. Tavor?
Yeah, so first I want to say that I'm very excited and very honored to have this call. I said before, like, I read many of Dr. Hornsby papers, listened to many of his podcasts, so it's I'm very honored. And so my name is Tavor Ben Zeev. I'm a doctoral student at Ariel University at the sports science program. My dissertation, my research topic, it's divided between exercise physiology and sports science. And weightlifting is also like my passion. I'm a weightlifting coach, still competing. And yeah, so we just finished a weightlifting study. It's accepted to JSER, and yeah, I'm very excited and happy to talk about weightlifting and strength and condition.
All right. So, Kyle, you mentioned that your specialty or focus is the isometric positions. So, but this question is also for everyone. Like, how comes the isometric mid-thigh pull into the discussions about performance for any sport generally, or and for weightlifting? Let's maybe start there, and then we go towards the snatch pulls and different variation of the isometric pulls.
Sure, yeah. So the isometric mid thigh pull is a pretty nice tool to use if you can get one. I mean, there's different ones where it's like a huge rack where you have an isometric pull in there, and there's a Cairo rack, which is a smaller, a little bit more portable rack. But basically, you're using those force plates, and you get into a good power position or a mid thigh pull position, and then you apply force through the bar. And it doesn't move, and you can measure the force output with the force plates beneath you. So not only can you do this with weightlifters, but you can also do this with other sporting teams and various sport contexts, and you can monitor their force and their changes in force, their specific adaptations to training over time, and you can look at things like rate of force development, peak force, impulse, and the force plates, depending on what you have, can also give you different things and different measurements. But for me, my kind of dissertation and my kind of area of focus here is going to be on weightlifters specific, and we have weightlifters here at WU, but we also have some weightlifters at ETSU that are going to let me test them as well, and potentially at LSU Shreveport may potentially also let us test their athletes as well. So we'll have a good pool of athletes to test, and some decent numbers within that. Yeah, I'm interested in looking at and Tavor and I were talking about it earlier. We'll probably go over it again, but talking about the start position of the pull and the transition, not just doing it from the mid-thigh pull position. That in weightlifting, the start and the transition are sometimes things that can make or break the lift if you're not strong enough to hold that position, or to have good technique off the floor. That can hinder your success in weightlifting. So it's something that I'm interested in measuring because of that. I think that's it.
So the idea then is that measuring the force, and after a certain training period, measuring the force output again in this pull is indicative of improved athletic performance. That's what I guess.
Yeah. So you can take, if you measure at the start of the program, or if you have a macro cycle of training that you have planned, you can test them before they go through that training, and then you can test them after, or you can test them in the middle as well to see kind of where they're at, and see if where they should be, if kind of expect what to see, and then you can compare pre and post, and that kind of tells you one, how well your training program works, but two, their fatigue levels. If you're monitoring at specific, like let's say you do it after a block of 3x10s, that's going to be a heavy volume block. You can probably expect them to be pretty fatigued after that. And if you have data over many years, you can kind of compare that to previous blocks of 10s, and kind of see like what your program did and how they're managing fatigue.
And William, so what other sports use or useful? What other sports is the isometric mid-thigh pull useful, because I can see how it can be useful for Olympic weightlifting, but for other sports, I'm not really familiar.
So I think maybe something helpful for this discussion would be to provide some history in the, how the test sort of came to be, and as far as I know, if you go back to the University of Auburn in the 1980s. Mike Stone and some others, Kyle Pierce would have been there at the time. Harold O'Brien, or excuse me, John Garhammer would have been there right in the beginning. They had, I want to say it was called the National Strength Research Center. And they brought in, I'm blanking on one other person's name, so forgive me, but they brought in some big time researchers that were all interested in some type of strength and conditioning, performance related science. And so the idea, and they were doing a whole lot of experimentation at the time. They were interested in various aspects of strength power training, strength power development, and part of that would be how do we assess? And so they started essentially messing around with force plates, and they this conversation was a couple years ago, but Damon Davis, who's a strength coach, he's the head strength coach for Auburn basketball, men's basketball, told me that in the old physical education building, these force plates that they originally worked with are still bolted into the ground there. And that what they did was they had this idea of, okay, if with the force plate we can get a force time curve. If we do an isometric test, we can get an isometric force time curve. And I think just very generally, a lot of the interest for that was, one, the amount of control that we can provide in terms of fixed joint angles and very position specific. Part of it would be we can assess a peak force, which in an isometric case would be representative, they thought, of maximal strength. So you have time for the forces generated to accumulate and come to an isometric peak. And so they actually started with not a pull isometric test, but a back squat. And we've seen there's several papers, and there's even been some recently that have been isometric squat tests. And so they looked at isometric squat in various knee and hip angles. And I've heard stories about how they actually had custom built bars to where you get a strong person, you're doing something like a quarter squat, or a very, very strong position, people can move it a little bit. And so they needed it to be heavy enough to where it couldn't be moved. And so they had bars that were longer on the ends than typical, and they got the really heavy 100-pound plates and just loaded up until it was so heavy people couldn't move it. And that I guess a couple things with that. One, they found that the isometric squat test can probably result in some lower back stress, and there was concerns about potential injury in that. And then eventually that, as time went on, that led to customized racks. Kyle mentioned power racks and other designs as well. And so the discovering what is probably most commonly referred to as the isometric mid-thigh pull, or the isometric strength test from the power position, that actually didn't so much come from a weightlifting context to begin with, in that what they did was they looked at these various knee and hip angles and found that quarter squat position produce the highest peak forces. And so initially, and you'll see that with the, if you go from a pull to a squat and you keep those positions the same, they found that with the back squat as well. And so it's a very advantageous position for producing peak forces. And so that's really why they chose that position early on. I think as us being weightlifting coaches and interested in weightlifting, the specific mechanical similarities between that power position or that isometric mid thigh pull and the power position, where second pull is initiated, that's very relevant to us as weightlifting coaches. But I think that this is both important for us as weightlifting coaches and using that test as a monitoring tool, but then also for other sports as well, is the understanding of kind of putting different variables through different lenses and contexts, and Kyle referred to peak force, so maximal strength. Being interested in how maximal strength is changing over time is something that not just weightlifting coaches probably should be interested in, and so I would say just very generally that's a program efficacy, a more long-term development type lens we would look at that through. There's some good research showing that in trained lifters, it's not something that fluctuates a ton, but over time it can improve. And I would say most recently, I believe it was the 2020 study by Joffe with the really high level UK lifters. Those females over 2 years, they did improve maximal strength, and the training ages were really, really high with those athletes. It could be more fatigue management, so more nervous system based, greater fluctuations, more sensitive to how they're changing in training. It can give us ideas in terms of how potentially developed an athlete might be, how they're responding to the training program. And I think what with Kyle and Tavor's research interest currently, we're getting more into the weeds and specifics of like weightlifting and position specific, and those types of things. And when I think through some of these discussions, it's often sort of through these two general lenses of, we have like strength, power development, and monitoring, and then we have the very more weightlifting specific positions and technique and strength at different positions. And I think it's all really interesting, and it's personally an exciting discussion.
Well, thank you, William, for that historical build up of how the isometric tests came into the field. It's really interesting. You said it was in the 1980s when they started doing this. Okay, that's
one
cool.
of the things that's research. The world of research, just even from cultural day in and day out, how things were done, with internet and no internet, no email, and all of those things, the way journals and research and peer review works now compared to then, there's some similarities, but there's also some differences. And I think at that time, there was a whole lot more, probably, at least in terms of the research I'm more familiar with, and like self-experimentation and sort of preliminary investigations leading to an actual study. And to give an example of this with the mid-thigh pull, the first published study on isometric mid-thigh pull was in 97. It was published in 97. The data would have been collected prior to that. Greg Hoff would be the first author on that. He was a student of Mike's, and so you can find some of that type of stuff even in training studies, going back to Harold O'Brien's dissertation when he and Mike Stone were at LSU, and to where there was it was kind of lab self-experimentation leading to eventually more controlled studies.
Cool.
And there was just so much less to go on and so much less built on. And one of the things from talking to Doc about some of this that I think we can appreciate with us being in different countries is, we have social media, we have Twitter, we have ResearchGate, we have all these different ways to where, we're getting to have a conversation with a researcher that has a paper accepted but not in print yet. It didn't work like that back then. And so one of the things I've heard Doc and some others talk about that have been doing this a really long time is that they don't find out they don't find out some lab in some other part of the world is doing something until years later, just because how things work differently. And so, some of the classic literature that we're familiar with as weightlifting coaches, even though much of that work was done before the 80s, it might not have been until the late 80s or 90s that people in the US discovered some of it, right? And so it just worked very differently. And so I think that experiments and research at different times has evolved in different ways.
Yeah, and I think it's for the better. I mean, we cannot be grateful enough for the benefits of the internet in this regard. I mean, in other regards, it's it has its drawbacks like everything else, but in this regard, I think
something without email.
It's amazing.
Or email or various cloud-based data storage systems, and you're talking about regular phone and snail mail, and it's a different world.
Exactly. So Tavor, now to you, because I think the discussion is shifting towards your paper, which William already mentioned, that it's in the process of being published. It's already accepted, and then it also gears into that specific weightlifting world with the how the isometric pulls figure on different positions. So would you mind just give a gist of what was the research about and what were the findings and stuff?
Yeah, of course. So our paper was to compare three different pulling positions and their correlation to weightlifting performance in competition. So we compared the position from the start, from the transition position, which is just below the patella, below the knee, and the power position, which is the mid-thigh pull. So we compared three of those positions, and we want to see which one of them has the highest correlation to weightlifting performance. So most of the studies are generally measuring the mid-thigh pull, which is the power position. And in weightlifting, we see there is a lot of emphasis on the power position and the second pull. But for me, the second pull and the power position, it's just a snapshot. So many things can get wrong from the start position and even more from the transition position. So I first saw this mentioned in Joffe paper when they also compared the start position and the isometric peak force from the start position and the isometric peak force from the power position. And they saw that the start position had higher correlation to weightlifting performance. So my idea was, okay, anecdotally, I saw also in my athletes and in also different athletes that the transition position, it's a much more like a technical position, and it's very hard to understand it, teach it, and execute it. And so my idea was maybe the correlation from the transition position is going to be even higher correlation to weightlifting performance. And so that's what we did. We got 30 weightlifters. 18 of them were males, 12 were females. All of them were like national weightlifters. And so we measured them a week before the competition, some of them a week after the competition. The competition was the Israeli national competition. And we measured their peak force in those three different positions, and then we made the correlation with their actual performance in the competition, correlation with the snatch, the clean and jerk, and the total. And what we found is that first, both of the start position, peak force from the start position and from the transition position had a higher correlation with weightlifting performance. The transition position had a slightly higher correlation compared to the start position, but the lowest correlation was from the power position, which is the mid-thigh pull. So if the correlation was, if I remember, it was like 0.86 from the mid-thigh pull, and then from the start it was 0.94, and then from the transition was 0.96, 95. So that's the first thing that we found, like the transition position and the start position, the peak force in those positions has higher correlation to weightlifting performance. And when we did analysis between males and females, we found something very interesting, and is that for females athletes, the highest correlation was from the start, which was very high. It was like around 96, but from the transition position and from the power position, the correlation was very low. It was 0.78 from the transition position, and from the mid-thigh pull, it was around 64, which is very different from the males and from when combining the two groups. And so that was like the most important finding that we found. When we also examining,
Tavor, how many females you have? Can you just remind me?
It was 12 females, and yeah, 12. When we also analysis their rate of force development at 250 milliseconds, we found that only in the females group, the only position that was correlated with weightlifting performance was from the start. From the males weightlifters, there weren't any correlation, not from the start position, not from the transition, and not from the power position. So that was also very interesting to see that only in the females athletes and the correlation was from the start position, the rate of force development correlation. So for me, those findings are very practical. I wanted to do like a research that is very practical for coaches to use. I think it's very practical from monitoring standpoint. If you want to monitor your athletes, like Kyle mentioned, and you want to see their progress, instead of using the mid-thigh pull, you can use the transition position or the start position. You will get a much higher correlation and assessment for their performance in those like weightlifting exercise, snatch, and the clean and jerk. And I think also it's interesting and important for us coaches to maybe think that the start position and the transition position needs to get more volume in terms of like exercise selection or strengthening like exercise. So those like that's my thought. With the rate of force development, it's very interesting. We're planning to do maybe a follow-up research to see what's like why for specific to females athletes, rate of force development from the start is correlation. It had like high correlation to weightlifting performance compared to the men, and when we combined the two groups. So yeah, that's the study. I hope it will get published soon. Yeah. If you have any questions.
I have some questions, but I just want you guys if how it is related to what you want to see. How was I right in saying that, you know, this is something that you are also looking into and stuff like that? So just go ahead and talk.
Dr. Hornsby, you want to?
Yeah, I mean, I think that all of us can appreciate the, you know, monitoring, assessment. If we're just going under that whole umbrella of research, I think there's two aspects of one, through the actual test itself, that research, how can we better learn about performance in the sport, and can we, learn things that might be helpful for training and for coaching. But then there's also the taking that information and trying to apply it to our own monitoring protocols and sort of where and how to, frequency of testing, what type of system structure, battery, is there certain things we might want to assess after every block of training, a couple times a year, pre-post macro cycle, getting more micro level, like weekly, intra-weekly, those types of things. And so I think that, if we're talking about, I kind of alluded to this a little earlier on, strength power development monitoring, and then more sort of weightlifting specific. And so I think that one of the really exciting things, and I very much agree with Tavor, I think we need to do much more of this work, and it seems like there's several of us are interested in this area. And so I think in the next 5 to 10 years there will be quite a whole bit done, a whole lot done. I think that one that's interesting about the females, and I'm less confident speaking to some of that, but I think that, so one, when it comes to peak force from the power position, I think that we're still finding, and Kyle actually found some very similar things. We've at this point it's only been presented at National Strength and Conditioning Association's national conference in poster form. We're working on turning it into a manuscript. But it seems that, between what we found, what we observed, what Tavor observed, what Jaffe observed, this, slightly better correlation from the start, that seems to really be something to it there. That's awesome to hear about Tavor doing looking at from the knee. That is that's the first. This will be the first published study that's looked at all three in one, and so that gets at some of our interest and Kyle's research interest as a doc student of, kind of putting together this picture of more of the entire pull and looking at specific areas, and is there a part of the pull that we might need to address? Tavor mentioned work, heavy work off of the floor perhaps, or isolating that start position, doing strength work starting at the knee, or focusing more on that development of the strength and the transition. And so you have that more weightlifting development assessment, and then you have more the general strength assessment, and so like we find higher peak forces at the power position, and so because of that, I think that still might be the better way to assess maximal strength, but assessing maximal strength and using a test to better figure out, what might we best improve to perhaps it translates to the actual snatch and clean and jerk in competition. We know that those things are also related. So someone's maximal strength, and then so taking peak force from the power position and looking at force production at those other positions. And so to me, I start to get into this thing of where do these different assessments fit? How can we better use them? And I think just to what Tavor's describing, what he did, we're basically trying to do the same type of thing here and better learn. One, can we get a better picture of a weightlifter's overall pull, and then, okay, we've done that. Now, how might that relate to some adjustments we make to our training plan and our coaching? I think that one of the nice things about measuring from the start is the start's the same for everybody, and so compared to the knee or from the power position, that's much quicker. And the other thing, and I'm curious to hear what Tavor has to say about this. In the one time we've done it, and we're about to do it again, the athletes found the position at the start, and I'm interested to see if they'll say some similar things about at the knee. they complained about low back stress a little bit. And I mean, we can picture those positions and that. And so those are just a couple little sidebars. And so I'm not saying this in like a definitive, this is exactly how it should be used. But one of the things I can kind of picture is if we have isometric strength testing integrated throughout our training process, you know, maybe twice a year, there's a very full, robust assessment, and you could include other things as well, like actual, you know, barbell trajectory while with doing a snatch or a clean on a force plate, the isometric forces at those different key positions, and then maybe a little bit more, and then more frequently, an isometric pull from the power position that's more strength, you know, strength, rate of force development, alteration assessment. That's more how are they from a neuromuscular standpoint responding like to a given training block. And you could throw in things there of like dynamic pulls, jump protocols. And so now you can kind of picture this scaling assessment, and it's kind of just from a coaching view of putting things in where they fit and being able to, you know, not just try to test and assess as absolutely as much as possible, but what is efficient, what answers certain questions we have. And I think it's exciting stuff. And I, you know, I enjoyed listening to Tavor describe it, but I'm even as, you know, more excited to read the paper and get into the details of that.
Right. So, sorry, Tavor, go ahead.
No, I just want to say that, yeah, first, like that's what we found, like athletes, like when they did the pulling from the start position, yeah, many of them said, like mentioning like stress on their lower back. And so, yeah, like that was, it's hard to say a limitation, but it was uncomfortable for some of them in like in the first trial. So yeah, of course. So, but in the transition position, they felt much like easier for the lower back. So we didn't have any like negative feedback from the pulling from the transition, of course, also from the mid-thigh pull. And we did found that, I mean, it's anecdotally, but the transition, pulling from the transition position was a bit like awkward for them. They couldn't really get their body fitting, which for me, it was very interesting because you also can see it like in real time lifting, like how awkward this position of like the transition from below the knee to above the knee. And so that was very interesting. And we also saw that like the absolute peak force from the start position was higher than the transition, like pulling from the transition position, which was, for me, it was very interesting because like pulling from below the knee, it's still like kind of more like advantage, like the position, it's more favorable for producing force than the start position. But I think for if like I'm considering like the stress for their back, yeah, the start position was a bit like stressful, but pulling from their transition position from below the knee was, I think, they felt really like comfortable regarding their lower back. So maybe that position is maybe like better for like monitoring and assessing like performance correlated to weightlifting, like from the entire like macro cycle. But again, not for females. So I would say for females athletes, maybe the best position to keep monitor is the start position, and not from a standpoint of like neuromuscular like maximum strength, but for like if I want to do like a correlation to their weightlifting performance.
Thank you.
Okay, so just to summarize two takeaways that I get, and I might be wrong in this. So the isometric mid-thigh pull is a great tool to measure or be an indicator of maximal strength development of any athlete in any sport. And then what Tavor found is that there is higher correlation of other position isometric pulls to weightlifting specific performance, means that those positions are more important for the Olympic weightlifters as sportsmen. We can for their performance in Olympic weightlifting, which is the measurement of their maximal strengths in those movements, but not the measurement of their general maximal strengths. So we can still refer to like the power position, even in their case, on their general maximal strength capacity. And then what I take Tavor's findings to also be is that in sport-specific training for the weightlifters, these findings that the correlation is higher in the transition position and in the start position for females means that making these positions stronger by higher volume of pulls, maybe if that's one thing to make this position stronger, can be beneficial. Is that like a correct summarization of what we talked about?
Yes, I would add a couple things. I would say that one of the things with from the floor is every lifter when they if they're actually doing a snatch or clean and jerk, right? They're starting with the bar being still, and they're starting at no velocity, and then they're going to produce force, and there's going to be a velocity, and then from there, bar trajectory, specific things related to technique can be different, and so thinking about power position, when we do that isometric test, they're flat-footed. We're able to put them in a great power position and control it really well. We've all seen lifters hit various looking power positions where good lifters, we tend to see the torso is very vertical, and so like the hip and knee ranges can be mimicked, but they might not hit that exact position with the flat feet and center of pressure being in the middle of the foot, right? We'll see them a little bit more on their toes, and so they're essentially directing up. There'll be, by the time the bar gets to the knee, there can be differences from one weightlifter to the next in terms of where center of pressure of the foot is, exactly where the bar is in relationship to them, all of those things. And so I know this is a very, I'm making things a bit more gray by saying what I'm about to say, but I think that more research is needed. And I also think that to steal a line from someone I was lucky enough to have in the classroom, Bill Sands, if we're talking about assessment and monitoring, it should be more probably about a constellation to where we can start to put pieces together, and we're, I think, in the coming years going to be able to get more and more data, learn more and more about it, and become more confident in the takeaways. And then at the same time, as coaches, there's always that we take that information, and then there's like the individual athlete situation to where, like, I would never, if Tavor's got an athlete he's coaching, and okay, he's done these tests and he has this data, I wouldn't be confident in the least of like looking at that data and then saying, okay, well, this is how you should train that athlete, this is how you should coach that athlete. It's all of those things kind of coming together, the art, the science, and then we've gone in a very short period from very little to no data on a bunch of the things we're talking about to where we've seen this rapid ramp up, and so I think that's just going to continue, and I wouldn't be surprised if some other labs are going to be doing some of the same stuff we're looking at doing and have been doing.
Right. So Tavor, just to finish up, so being a coach, seeing the studies, and I know that just like William just said, it's hard for, creating a training program for an individual athlete based on these results you should always consider that individual, and then the relation of the coach to that individual. But what were the takeaways for you in the training of your athletes? How did you change your athletes training based on the results? And what are the follow-ups, if any, so far? I mean, I know it's a very recent study, so the time might not have been enough to alter the conclusions. But what are the directions you are going based on the results?
Yeah, so first I just want to say that because correlation does not equal causation, like we measure like peak force from an isometric pulling position. So like we can say those like for weightlifters, the start position and the transition position may be more like important for weightlifters, but it's important to understand that we didn't measure like a dynamic pulling. Like we didn't measure a dynamic, like the entire pull from a dynamic, like doing a snatch or a clean, or just a snatch pull or a clean pull. So it's very important to understand it. But like saying that, what I saw in the study, and also from my anecdotally like observation, I am thinking that like the start position and then transition position have like better correlation to weightlifting performance, and also because like power position, like Dr. Hornsby said, it's a snapshot. Like you need to be able to get to the power position, like the like right position to execute, like to being able to do like maximum strength from the power position. It's not easy, like all of us can like knowing that. And like when you put an athlete doing like snatch or clean from blocks, like at the power position, they can hit like massive like weights, like doing like a PR, but it's very different from the floor, because when you are like in the right position, like the right position for the power position, it's much easier. So like my takeaway from our study is that first, like start position, like athletes must like needs to be strong in the start position. So for me, like the start position, it's much more like of a strength movement and less about technique, because you need to be able to overcome the inertia of the barbell. So if you're not strong enough to lift it with like the appropriate velocity from the ground, that's a problem. So you need to be stronger, but strong in the right position. So the position that we know, because like clean and snatch are different from deadlift. So it's a combination of being strong in the right position. And the transition position for me, it's more like a technical position. So the technique is higher than doing like when I compare it to the pulling like start position. So from my program, when I program now for my athletes, so yeah, our like frequency and volume that is specific to making sure the start position is stronger is pretty high. So we're doing a lot of pulls, pulling with pause at the knee or below the knee. And then from making sure the transition position, the technique is solid, we're doing things like yo-yo clean, yo-yo snatch, like also like pauses at different position, below the knee, above the knee, playing with those positions, making sure the athlete understand how to move their knees, when to put the barbell in terms of their body. But that's like mostly, but I do think like weightlifters has to be strong, because I see like people saying that weightlifting, like of course weightlifting is a speed sport, but I think like you have to be strong. And what we found is that like strength, like peak force was a lot more correlated than speed, than rate to force development or time to peak force. So for me, like making sure the athlete is strong in the right position from the start and know how to move the barbell around the knee is extremely important. So then it's just a question how I allocate the volume and exercise selection for those positions. That's mostly what I can take from our study.
Okay, and then one last question, to both of you actually. Like,
Could I add to that?
Yeah, sorry.
Because I think that's a fun conversation, because I think that starts to get more into the, if coaches are able to and are interested in doing this type of testing, that the individual athlete level, and thinking about influence in training programs and that type of stuff. Some of the things Tavor hit on, of like, I mean, one, just the idea that if you only improve strength at the power position, okay, well, when you actually do the full lifts, you might never get into a good power position with heavy weight, because the things that occur before that don't go well. And for exercise selection, overloading the pull off of the floor. Tavor mentioned pausing at different points, maybe before the knee, in front of the knee, those types of things. Starting the pull from the knee. Really heavy stuff off of the floor. And I think that one of the things I would like to better try to understand with some of this potential test protocol would be, and it might take, Tavor mentioned, in addition to isometric tests, maybe also including a dynamic test, whether it's a pull or a full lift, both, to connecting that. I think that's a little bit further down the road. I know that I'd say that speaking for myself in our own lab, but maybe eventually getting to a point of better understanding. I don't think enough data exists yet of like, I actually don't like even referring to normative data with this type of stuff, because it is so specialized. But okay, getting a better understanding of like various weight classes and sex, and what would be like an impressive force output, that type of stuff. But then maybe saying, okay, this is sort of where the hole in your pull is. This is where things go wrong. This is maybe where we should allocate more training, more volume, that type of stuff. And so that would very quickly get very individual athlete specific, very nuanced, and kind of putting, you can picture like putting pieces together with some of that from a coaching standpoint.
Right. So, can you imagine like a correlation, speaking of normativity of the results and stuff, that there are not that many test subjects, because these type of research are actually requiring a proper setup for a weightlifting team. But my experience with all these type of correlational studies is that the results get better with the number of participants increasing in the study. So just an idea for you to maybe get together and collect data together and then write something together, because that's fun.
One of the things I actually was just thinking as you were saying that was, there might be something to weight classes with some of that. I mean, there's some well-established bar trajectory stuff on, when you compare the really light classes compared to the really heavy. Might there be something to that with isometric testing off of the floor, to where it's even more important that they can hit a certain force output if they're really light, versus if you're talking 109 super heavies, 81s, whatever it might be. The short answer is yes. When you get into the logistics of some of this, peak force is a very, I think, easy, you can use different softwares, different hardwares, those types of things. This gets boring quickly, but for other things like we've mentioned, rate of force development, sometimes that can get trickier depending on lab setups and equipment and software and that.
All right, guys. Well, thank you so much. I learned a lot, and now I see clear a lot of things. And just to close up, where can people find you, follow you, if they are interested, find your work? If you could say just a couple of words about that.
Yeah, of course. So you can find me on Instagram. It's Tavor WL, and on ResearchGate. Also, you can find me. Yeah.
I'm same. I'm my Twitter and Instagram handles are Coach Guyton, Guyton, and then I'm on ResearchGate as well, and I like to think I do a pretty good job of, like, if something is where I have to share it through a direct message, that I try to keep up with that.
All right, guys. Thank you so much, and have a great day.
Thank you. Thank you very much.